Hey everyone, this is Stephen Robles, the Bearded Teacher here, and in this video, I'm going to show you how you can create, host, and launch your own podcast using Squarespace. Now, there are lots of podcast hosts out there. I've used multiple and still do. You have Fireside, Buzzsprout. A lot of those podcast hosting services also provide a website for your show as well, but maybe you need a more robust website where you can also sell products and have an online store. Maybe you want an additional blog. Maybe you're showing off some of your portfolio or work stuff. Or maybe you already have a Squarespace site. And if you already pay for a Squarespace website, you can host your podcast there included in that cost. It's at no additional charge. And it works great. I've hosted multiple podcasts using Squarespace before. So I'm going to walk you through setting up a podcast from scratch directly in Squarespace and even submitting it to the different podcast services. So of course you want to log into your Squarespace website. You go to squarespace.com, log in, and that's where I am right now. And I've logged into my Bearded Teacher website. And so if you have a Squarespace website, or maybe you're just creating one, this is what you get when you first log in to access your website. If you've never used Squarespace before, or you need a tutorial on how to get started, I actually have a video. It's pretty long, it's about 45 minutes, but there's chapters and you can jump around, and I walk you through setting up a Squarespace website from scratch and the basics of editing the site as well. You can check out that video in the link above. So to create a podcast here on my Squarespace website, I'm going to go to the Pages section. This is where you create and edit the pages of your website. And here I'm going to create a new page for the podcast. Now, if you're new to Squarespace or you're not familiar with this, you have the main navigation up here and then the not linked pages. These pages are still active, but they don't show up in the navigation at the top of the website. I'm going to put it in the not linked section because in order to do a podcast in Squarespace, you actually create a blog page, but it's not really the best way to showcase your episodes. And I'll show you how you can showcase them later in this video. But I'm going to create a new page here in the not linked section. I'm going to hit the plus icon, and so you get all the different page options. And to create a podcast, you're actually going to choose a blog page. So here under collections, this is a blog. And also be aware that I'm using Squarespace 7.1. This is the newest version of Squarespace, and it has kind of the newest features. If you're on an older version of Squarespace like 7.0, it might look a little different, but you also use a blog page to create a podcast. So I'm going to click blog, and it's going to ask me, what kind of blog page I want. It doesn't really matter the appearance right now. I'll just choose this list or blog 3 section. Now you'll see the title is highlighted over here, so you can choose what to call it. I'm actually just going to call it podcast and hit enter. And now I see the list of posts already created in this blog page. In case you missed it, I'll go back to my full list of pages, and you'll see here at the top of the not linked section is my podcast page. Now, before I jump into actually messing with the episodes and posts, I'm actually going to hit this little gear icon next to the podcast page. Now, when you hit that gear icon, you have several options. Again, if you're new to Squarespace or if you're not familiar with this is where you change the page title, the slug, or whatever the slash something on your website that you want it to be. And this matters because the RSS feed or link, this is the URL you're going to give to Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and Spotify to submit your show. This actually dictates what that URL looks like. So your podcast feed is going to be your website domain. In my case, it's beardedteacher.com/ and then whatever I put here in this window. That's why I want to keep it pretty simple, and I'm just going to call it podcast. So you have the page title, podcast, navigation title, podcast, and I'm going to keep my URL slug as just /podcast. Now, I'm going to go down to feeds here in this window, and you'll see that podcasting is an option for feeds. And so I'm going to click that podcasting option, and here's where you're going to input all the information for your podcast, the title, the description, all of that. So you want to have a good title. This is branding your podcast right now. We're launching one. And because my brand is The Bearded Teacher, I'm just going to call it The Bearded Teacher. Quick tip, I've actually spoken with some people from Apple Podcasts, and Apple Podcasts is not crazy about you actually putting the word podcast in the title of your show. So I would encourage you just title it whatever the title you want it minus the word podcast. So I'm just going to call it The Bearded Teacher. Now for the author, maybe this is you and a co-host, but I'm going to put my name here for author. So there's my name. And then the description, this is the description of the podcast as a whole. This appears when someone finds your podcast in Spotify or Apple Podcasts, and it should provide a summary of what your podcast is about. So I'm going to type something like, tune in weekly for technology tips and tricks for iPhone, iPad, Mac, and building your own website. Of course, that can be longer in that description box, but I'll just put that for now. Now, cover art, this is going to be the artwork for your podcast that shows up in podcast players and when people search for podcasts. You want to have a good quality image, about 3,000 pixels maximum in size, and it has to be a square. So 3,000 pixels wide, 3,000 pixels tall, but you basically want a high resolution square. You can make that on your own, hire a graphic designer. I actually have a little graphic here that I call podcast art. So I'm going to upload that image file, just a JPEG, into that cover art box, and you'll see it upload there. And now I have my podcast art. I'm going to go down and select language. So this is the language that's spoken on the show. Mine is English. I'm going to go down again, type. Most podcasts are probably going to just use the episodic or default listing, unless you really know the format of your podcast is that serial older podcast first. That's like if you have like a TV season type show where you want people to go in order, oldest to newest, it actually puts the oldest at front. But I would just choose episodic, the default option for most podcasts. The length, this can actually show up to 100 episodes in someone's podcast player or up to 300 episodes. So hopefully you'll be podcasting for a long time. You probably want to have as many episodes available to your listeners as possible. So I'm going to choose optimized for podcasting, supports up to 300 episodes in that list. When it comes to categories, this is the genre or the category your podcast is in. Maybe mine is in technology, so I'll choose the technology category and go back. You can also add secondary and tertiary categories. So maybe it's about technology, but I'm also teaching people how to do stuff. So I'm going to choose education as well. And so those are my categories. I'm going to go down to copyright. This will be, an official copyright notice. Again, unless you have some really protective intellectual property, you probably don't need to put anything here, but you can if you want to. Maybe the year and the name. I'm going to scroll down again. Contact details. This is important because when you submit your show to Apple Podcasts or Spotify, they're going to confirm that you're the owner of this podcast by sending an email to the email address that you list here. And so you can put your name in the name field, and then in the email, make sure you put a good email address that you're going to get those messages to confirm your podcast. So you put your email there. Scroll down one more time. You can choose whether or not your podcast has explicit content like profanity in it or not. Or if it's clean, you can leave that toggle unchecked. And then change feed is if you are moving from an old podcast host, or maybe you're moving your current feed away to a different hosting company. That's what these change feed options are for. But I'm going to assume you want to host your podcast here in Squarespace and you're starting fresh. So I'm not going to do anything in the change feed section. Now, once you have all that information just like you want, you can choose the connect option. And once you do that, it confirms all your stuff, and now you are ready to submit your feed to the different podcast providers. But you probably want to put an episode first, or even a trailer for your podcast before you submit it to the store. You don't want to submit your RSS feed to Apple Podcasts or Spotify without some kind of episode already loaded in the list. So now we're going to go on to actually creating our first episode for the podcast. So I'm going to go back to the pages navigation here, that left sidebar column. I'm going to click the podcast page. And the first thing I'm going to do is get rid of these stock demo posts that have already appeared when I first created the page. So I'm going to X out this window. I'm going to click these little three dots and hit delete on all these posts, and then hit delete one more time. Now we're ready to create our first podcast episode. And to do that, every time you add a new episode to your podcast, you're going to click the plus icon here at the top of this left column. When I hit the plus icon, you'll see a new post is created. And it's really formatted for like a written blog post, but that's okay. It's going to work for the podcast as well. Post title, just imagine you're putting your podcast title here. So maybe this is the Bearded Teacher trailer. And you can put kind of whatever text here or no text at all. Your podcast feed is actually not going to pull from the text here on the blog page. So you can just type nothing or actually type nothing, and that's fine. Now, because this is a podcast, you should have an audio file. And so we're going to add our audio file by using the little plus button. And again, if you need help kind of with page layout, using blocks, check out my first Getting Started with Squarespace guide. But I'm going to click the plus icon, and one of the blocks available to us in this little window that pops up is the audio block. This is what you're going to use every time you add an episode. And now you'll see we have a kind of audio player there, but with no file. And now we need to add an audio track. So this little window that popped up over here is where you're going to add all the information, including the audio file, for the podcast episode. Considering this is a podcast and you want it to be as universally playable as possible, I recommend an MP3 file. You can do chapters with that MP3 file. You can even add artwork to specific MP3 files. I won't get into editing audio just yet in this video, but you want to upload an MP3 file for your podcast. I'm just going to choose a random MP3 file for now. Now you want to wait till the audio file uploads all the way before you're adding text in these other boxes. I found if you start typing in those boxes, when the audio file finishes uploading, it then kind of wipes it all clean because it pulls from the MP3 file titles and stuff automatically. So just wait till the audio file uploads completely. You'll see it's processing and identifying. Now it's kind of auto-filled some stuff, but I can adjust this now once it's been uploaded completely. So just a little tip there. So for title, this is going to be the title of your episode. Again, I'm going to call it the Bearded Teacher Trailer. And for the author artist, this is you and a co-host. I'll just put my name for there. And now, well, this is the important part. We have to go over to this podcasting tab in the middle. This is actually the information that's going to show up in people's podcast players when they play this episode of your show. So the title of the episode, again, I've been calling it the Bearded Teacher Trailer. Subtitle, this is kind of that little brief bit of text that people will see when they are looking at your episode list of your show, or maybe it comes up in search results. So you could say, this is a trailer for my new show. Summary, again, is kind of the small amount of text that shows up in a episode listing. A lot of times you can kind of use the same text for both, depending on how much text you have in the subtitle and summary. The episode note is the important text. This is what you'll see when you look at a podcast in your podcast player and you see show notes or episode notes. I'll show you a couple examples. So when you look at an episode in Apple Podcasts and you scroll down, you'll see the episode notes here at the bottom where you have text, you can have links, you can have formatting like bullets. And this is the episode notes that you put here in the Squarespace website. And these episode notes show up in pretty much all podcast players, Spotify, Overcast, Pocket Cast. So you want to have good episode notes. You can also add links to this. And so maybe you want to write a quick summary. I'm just going to put some filler text here for now. That's some Latin for you. And then you can also bold some stuff. Not a lot of bold and italics come through in different podcast apps, but you can do a link here. Maybe you want to link to a Patreon or link to the full website. You can click this little paperclip and you can put in your website. I'll put in beardedteacher.com and hit apply. And those links will be in the episode notes of your listener's podcast player. Once you have your episode notes how you like, scroll down a little more and you'll see episode type. This is a trailer, so I'm going to select trailer as my type, but most often you're going to choose the full or default option. This is a full episode. So you have full episodes, that's most of the time, or you can say this is a trailer. If you want to use seasons for your podcast, maybe you plan on having like set season 1, season 2, and a specific amount of episodes in each season, you can put season numbers there. Episode number, again, this is something is important, especially in Apple Podcasts, where it will order your podcast by this episode number. And so I like to put 2 zeros and then a number. Hopefully you get to hundreds of episodes in your podcast. And so I'll do 001 for the episode number. Episode duration, it should actually pull the minutes and seconds from the file you uploaded, but you can also manually put in the length of the audio file that you are uploading to this. Again, if it has explicit content or not. And this last box is for podcast analytics. So if you want to use a service like PodTrack, podtrac.com, I'll put a link in the description below. You can track your downloads and your audience through that external service if you put in that prefix there. Squarespace does give you metrics on podcast downloads and subscribers, but if you really want to track your podcast audience, you probably want to use something like PodTrack, and you would put that prefix there. I'm going to leave it blank for now because I haven't set up PodTrack for this show. Once I've filled out all the information in this podcasting tab and I have the audio file in the embed, I'm all done with this show. This episode of the podcast is ready to go. And so I'm going to go up to the done here in the top left of Squarespace, and I'm going to hit publish. But you can also schedule this to publish at a later date. Maybe you want your show to come out every Friday morning, but you're done with the episode Wednesday afternoon. Well, I can click the schedule option and say, publish this on Friday, and I want you to publish it early. Sometimes it takes a few hours for podcast episodes to hit the podcast apps like Apple Podcasts or Google Podcasts. So if you want people to actually see it on Friday, I would publish it early, like 4 a.m. And then Squarespace will automatically post this episode to your podcast feed at that time. So I'm going to choose to publish it or schedule it then, or if you just want to publish it right now, you can hit publish. And so I actually just hit publish, so it's live. And there we go. I have the first episode is called the Bearded Teacher Trailer. And that's it. That's how you add new episodes to this new podcast I just created in Squarespace. When you're ready to add a second episode, same process. You hit the plus icon to create a new post. You enter the episode title. You add an audio block by clicking the plus icon, audio. You upload your MP3 file, and you fill out all the information in the podcast tab, just like we just did. And so that's how you add new episodes for as long as you want. And there's no limit to the amount of episodes that you can upload to Squarespace. You have unlimited storage. You don't have to worry about hosting charges for how many people download it or anything like that. Now that my podcast is ready and my feed is ready, I need to submit this podcast to the different podcast platforms. You probably want to do Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and Spotify. And you can submit it to those podcasting platforms individually. Now to do that, you need your RSS feed URL. Now, Squarespace doesn't make it super easy to find your URL for your feed, but here's a way to do it and make sure you get the exact right feed URL to submit to the podcast players. I'm going to go to some random page. I can go to even my home page if I want to do this. I'm going to click the edit button. Again, you can do this on any page you'd like. I'm going to scroll down towards the bottom, and I'm going to hit the plus icon to add a new block like we did with the audio block. And I'm going to search in this box here for RSS. And you'll see RSS is actually an option for a block. I'm going to click RSS. You'll see this window pops up, and it wants you to choose which blog page to connect the RSS feed. So I'm going to choose podcast because that's the page we created. I'm going to click that. I'm going to go up to done and save just for a moment. And now I can actually right-click with my right mouse button on this podcast RSS. I can copy link address. And now my RSS feed is on my clipboard. I can actually hit the plus button here to open a new tab in Chrome, paste, and now you'll see there is my podcast URL. It's beardedteacher.com/podcast ? Format equals RSS. That's your RSS feed URL for your podcast. Now I can go back and delete that block I just put on my homepage because it's an eyesore. Maybe I just don't want it. But the link stays the same. Once you have found that link, you're good to go. Now, you can also just remember whatever link we set in the page settings. Remember how I said I'm just going to call it podcast to keep it simple? The RSS feed is that link, beardedteacher.com/podcast, and then you just add this formatting of ? Format equals RSS. So if you're not exactly sure or you forget where to find it, but you know the URL for your podcast page is your URL, beardedteacher.com/podcast, you can just add the text, ? Format all lowercase equals RSS. That's your RSS URL. Using the block might be a little easier. Maybe put it on your website somewhere where you can go back and refer to it regularly. So I'm going to copy this URL, and this is my podcast feed URL or RSS feed. That's what the podcast platforms are going to ask for to submit it. Now, to submit this RSS feed, I would do it again in 3 different places. So the first place I'm going to submit my feed is to Apple Podcasts. A lot of other podcast apps actually use Apple Podcasts directory, and so your podcast will show up in a lot of those third-party apps automatically once you add it here. Now, you'll need to sign in with your Apple ID. If you don't already have an Apple ID, you can create one. You'll see they create yours now. But the website you go to is podcastsconnect.apple.com. I'll put that link in the video description below. Now, once you log in with your new iCloud account or your current iCloud account, this is the page you'll see. And I have podcasts already here, so I already have stuff. But to add your podcast to Apple Podcasts, to submit it, I'm going to click the little purple plus icon here next to podcasts, and I'm going to choose new show. Creating a new channel is really for multiple shows to be consolidated together. Maybe you're going to do paid subscriptions. But being your first podcast or you're just getting started, do new show. And then this little window will pop up. You see, I want to add a show with an RSS feed. That's exactly what we want to do. We're going to use our Squarespace RSS feed. And here is where you paste that podcast feed that we got from Squarespace. So you paste it right there, click add, and then Apple Podcasts is going to pull that RSS feed and see what we have here. Now it's going to process the show details for a little bit, but I can say this show does not contain third-party content. You don't want to use like popular songs or stuff like that in your audio show. You want to use royalty-free audio, if any. Show contact. This is, again, you're going to put your name here. You can put your phone number. That's optional. And then you want to put your email address. It should pull the email address you used in the Squarespace podcast setup. When you click save, it's going to take maybe a few hours, maybe even up to a day for Apple Podcasts to scrape that feed and get all the information. But once it does, they should send you an email. If not, come back to podcastconnect.apple.com and there'll be a publish button on this page to make your podcast live in the Apple Podcast directory. Even when you do that, it might take a couple hours for it to show up by search results, but it will be in Apple Podcasts and by proxy in a lot of other apps as well. So that's how you submit it to Apple Podcasts. Once it's pulled all the information for your podcast, you'll see it now say submit for review. When you click that button, Apple will review it for maybe a day, maybe up to 2 or 3 days. And once it's approved, then it'll be an Apple Podcast. You can then check back in the Apple Podcast dashboard. You might have to hit publish to make sure your podcast is totally live, but just come back and check it in the next day or so, and your podcast can then be pushed live to Apple Podcasts. Now, to submit it to Spotify, you're going to go to the website podcasters.spotify.com. If you don't have a Spotify account already, you'll need to create one for free. But if you already have a Spotify account, maybe you use it for music, you can use that login as well. Once you log in there to podcasters.spotify.com, I'm going to click these 3 dots here in the top left, and there's a add or claim your podcast option. I'm going to get started. And here again, you just paste the RSS feed from Squarespace and you put it right there. And it already tells me it's looking good. You can see the artwork, title, and the author, even the categories, everything automatically appeared as I submitted my RSS feed. I'm going to X out of this little window here, click next in the bottom right. It's going to ask you to confirm that it's you by sending a code to your email address. Then you'll be able to add some more details about the show, and then you'll be able to submit it to Spotify. They'll review it, approve it, and then your podcast will be in Spotify as well. Now, the last place I would submit your show is in Google Podcasts for the Android users out there. For that, you go to podcastsmanager.google.com. Again, all the links to submit your show will be in the video description below. Once you've signed in with your Google account, you can use a Google account you already have. If you don't have a Google account, you will need to create one to submit your show. You log in to the Google Podcast Manager, and you'll be prompted with an option to add a new show. Here, I already have some shows in here, but I'll click and add a new show. And it's the same process you saw on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. You enter your podcast feed. Let me get it from my clipboard manager here. And it's the same process like the other websites. I put my podcast feed here, click next step in the bottom right. It's going to load the information from that feed. You'll see the artwork, the title, description, the episode name is all there. I'm going to go to next step. It's going to send that verification code again to the email address you put in Squarespace. And so once you get that code to the email address, you put the code in there, and then Google will submit your podcast to their directory as well. So that's how you start a brand new podcast in Squarespace from scratch. You get your first episode up and then submit that RSS feed to Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Google Podcasts. And you're ready to go. Your podcast is now live on the internet for everyone to listen to. I host multiple podcasts myself. I'll put links to those podcasts in the video description below. Apple Insider Podcast, I talk about Apple and technology, movies on the side just for fun, and HomeKit Insider for all the smart home and HomeKit devices. If you're interested in those, again, links are below. If you found this video useful, hit the like and subscribe button. I'm going to be doing more tutorial videos on Squarespace, maybe on podcasting if you're interested in podcasts. I also have a bunch of iPhone and iPad tips here on the channel, so subscribe and hit that bell icon so you don't miss a video. And again, drop a comment. Maybe what's another video you'd like to learn about? Is it email marketing, website creation, podcasting? Leave a comment below, and I'd love to interact with you there. You can also follow me on Twitter. I'm pretty active there, and you can shoot questions or ideas for new videos. There on Twitter, I'm @Steven Robles. That link is down below as well. Thanks for tuning in. I'll catch you next time.